Hello and welcome to the Discovering Sligo podcast. In this series, we're going to discover lots about the past and present of Sligo, from geology to archaeology, history, heritage, folklore, fishing, music, and more. Join me and my guests and my dog Lucky as we discover what Sligo has to offer. So, hello and welcome to the second episode of the Discovering Sligo podcast. You might be wondering after episode 1, who is Sally? Well, it would be remiss of me not to talk about myself at some point. My name is Sally Siggins and I was born, have grown up and live in the wonderful county of Sligo, right by the coast on the Maharau Peninsula overlooking Sligo Bay. Maharau, of course, meaning the plain of Eve in translation, and as the locals call it in North Sligo, it's God's country. I was inspired to become an archaeologist through primary school outings to local sites such as Knocklane Hill, having a fairy stone on our farm, a visit by an archaeologist called Mark Keane to my primary school, and then also getting to know some local archaeologists such as Martin Timoney and Leo Layden and many more. I decided to study archaeology in college and did a 4-year degree in IT Sligo, now the ATU, and subsequently worked in commercial archaeology on road digs in Roscommon and Sligo before diverting to tourism. I worked in King House and Boyle in County Roscommon, but spent a lot of my time telling visitors how great Sligo was and sending them there, and so I was delighted to accept a job with the OPW the following year at Carramore Megalithic Cemetery in 2019. I've been working there since, apart from the COVID years, and was delighted to be promoted to head guide at Carramore last year in 2023. The role is currently seasonal, but I spend my winters doing projects such as this one and exploring the wonderful sites we have in Sligo, doing photography, walking my dog and helping out on the family farm amongst other things. I'm involved in the Sligo Field Club and will be taking on the role of president in February this year for 2 years. Additionally, I'm a board member of the Institute of Archaeologists of Ireland and a few other voluntary committees which I enjoy thoroughly. Most of the people on this podcast are people who have been involved in my journey so far in Sligo, from archaeologists to chefs to fishermen. I am privileged to have encountered so many interesting people who are passionate about Sligo. And I want to share a little snapshot of the best place in the world with you, wherever you are. And if you're from Sligo, hopefully you learn something new through this, the Discovering Sligo podcast. Right, that's enough from me. We better get on and talk to our guest for this episode. So, hello and welcome back to the Discovering Sligo podcast for our second episode. We are here in the Sligo Park Hotel this time, and a big thanks to them for giving us the room. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by well-known Connemara archaeologist Michael Gibbons. Michael, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
So Michael has a very large biography, so I'm going to give you a bit of a summary. So in terms of archaeology and heritage, you've worked for the Archaeological Survey of Ireland, to the Department of Antiquities in Jerusalem, directing excavations and surveys at important places such as Crowpatrick and even on the islands off the Connacht coast. Michael currently works in heritage tourism, like myself, and has his own specialist areas, which are the Boyne Valley and the west of Ireland. And that's only a very, very small summary of a very large bio. And you can find out lots more through this podcast and also by searching for him online. Michael, I think I met you first about 10 years ago now. Would that be right?
Yeah, there was a great conference on in Sligo at the time.
I was part of the organising committee for that weather-beaten archaeology conference back in 2014 when I was a student in IT Sligo. And really at that time, after a lot of storms took place, like this year, along the coast of Ireland, we had a lot of sites that were affected, and intertidal archaeology was really being brought to the fore in Ireland. And Michael, you were a real leading light in that field at the time. But since then, we've kept in touch over different archaeological subjects that really interest us. But about 4 or 5 years ago now, Michael got me into a bit of trouble, although he mightn't like to admit it, but we got banned, not just me and Michael, but actually about 3 of my own friends as well. Never let a bad thing like that get you down, so I didn't, and thankfully I set up my own Facebook group afterwards, which since 4 years at this stage has amassed over 10,000 followers. And if you haven't already joined that group, you can do so. It's called the Irish Archaeology Forum group, and it's a great way to learn about many different sites. And Michael is one of the top contributors to that since, and you've always got really interesting posts to share, from the Skelligs to the West Coast to Newgrange.
Yeah, and it's a great forum because we were banned because we said things to people who didn't agree. It was a discussion point. It was the stupidest banning on the history because we were commenting on public information and sites. And so it was one of the stupidest banning, but a very productive one. So sometimes good. And of course, a load of research has emanated out of the forum.
Absolutely. And Facebook is great. And sometimes it gets you down because there's an awful lot of to and fro in between people. But I think in terms of archaeology, it's a great place to start from if you don't know too much about archaeology. And like this podcast, it gets people thinking. So, Michael, thanks for joining me on the podcast. And I have a first question for you, which is to tell me a little bit about your background coming from Connemara, and also what inspired your passion for archaeology.
Well, I grew up in a house that was very interested in history. My father spent all his life abroad, almost all of it. He died young, but he worked in construction in Africa, in the Middle East, all over Britain. He ran big teams of Irish workmen generally on construction sites. But he grew up with a knowledge and interest in history and landscape and fly fishing and birds. He was a big man for bird watching, for example, which is unusual for a rough man from the west of Ireland to spend his life on construction sites. But he was had a sensitive side to him. And so he was and of course my older sister worked in Rome. When she was 18, she headed out. She also worked in Jerusalem. And my mother was very interested in local history, even though she hardly ever left Connemara. She was never in Sligo, for example. She might have got to Westport once every 10 years, once to Kerry.
So you're telling me Sligo was an exotic place?
Exotic, completely exotic. And it was when I first came here as well. But my mother was very interested in local history. And my grandfather had come back from America, from the Butte, Montana mines. So we're very conscious of mining history, unusually, because and my grand uncles, my mother's 9 brothers settled in Butte, Montana, and in Oregon. So most of our extended family went to America. So you had that link with across the water and history being important to immigrants. So anyway, I just took it from the ether, really, and I enjoyed it at school. I had a very good geography teacher growing up, Mrs. Marshall, top class, and very good history teachers. Just the way things are.
And of course, being surrounded by the landscape that you were growing up in had to have a wee part to play as well.
Oh yeah, because we grew up on the tide, looking at islanders coming in from Inishturk and Turbot in for fair days, in selling the fish. So I lived on the shore. Our house overlooks the sea. So and the hills are all around the town, like Sligo, very similar setting. Beautiful mountain country on the shore.
Yeah, beautiful part of Ireland down there. And speaking of Sligo, you were telling me recently how you were involved in Sligo in many different aspects over the years, but one was an excavation that you took part in with Stefan Berg. Can you tell me a bit about that? Yeah,
that was one of the very exciting times. We'd been working in Kells Priory on a student excavation with Tom Fanning, God rest him. Great medieval abbey outside Kilkenny, stunning place. And Reverend Impey's house, we were staying in the basement of his house. He was a brilliant historian, and we had and then from there we moved to Sligo and there was a lovely team of Irish students, these exotic tall Swedes, blondes, and Stefan was one of the big taller guys, of course. And Björn Holt himself was like a creature from a page of a storybook, tall, suave-looking Swede. And we were digging on 2 fascinating sites, which I still remember very well. Cullinamore Middens, down on the shore. It was like digging concrete. So hard to trowel them, little hard sites cut through them. Really, I'd never seen middens quite as dense before. And then above on the glen, that lovely chasm cutting across the east face of Knocknaray, a sort of big rectangular cashel in Lufferton, I think is the name of the townland. And underneath it, there's a large midden, of course, but it's a big rectangular cashel. Fantastic panorama all down across Ballastare Bay, and you're looking out onto the hills over to into the Ox Mountains, Colony, that area. So really stunning. And of course then we lived in Patricia Mulligan's old house, and John is actually her husband, and we had hammocks. And then, as if that wasn't enough, in the evening Martin Timoney was bringing us on field trips. So we went up to Grange looking at barrows. There's no barrows in the whole of Connemara, not a single one. And the big wedge tombs, Drumcliff. So this was, and the farmland, of course, because we were from Connemara, we're kind of scarce on decent land, and you're looking mouth-watering land all around Drumcliff. And so it was really, really important part of my, and of course the Ballastare Festival was on. I got to see that, got to hitch home after it, and but it was full of these. And of course the techniques that the Bjorn Hall, this is one of the things Irish archaeologists often forget, it was so well recorded. I mean, he might messed up on a few townland names, but his techniques were top of the range at the time.
And Michael, just remind people at home who Bjorn Hall
So Bjorn
is.
Hall was a professor of archaeology in Lund University, and he had spotted similarity just in the morphology between the tombs in Scania, southern Sweden, and the ones, these famous tombs of Carramore complex. And I think Michael O'Kelly, Professor of Cork, might have invited him over, possibly to an eye of the people in UCD. I have no idea. That wouldn't be at all past them. But in any case, this team came. And of course, they remained excavating for several seasons and came back later. And of course, the really annoying thing about the Swedish team was that they published their results within about 3 years of finishing their excavation. So they were right on, and they had aerial photography, they had paleobotany. But the actual techniques they use on the excavation, very detailed work. So fantastic sort of training ground. And so that was really, and of course, that's how I got to see Sligo and the immediate areas of it, because Martin Timoney was a very important part of that whole initial introducing Bjorn Hall to the wider Sligo landscape, if you like. So, and they did really, really good work. Like, just lasted. And because it was so well recorded, people have been able to look at the dates and say, well, actually, maybe it's this date. But he can do that because it was so well recorded. And that was in contrast to, say, the Newgrange excavations, which were terribly poorly recorded. So it was a high standard that the Swedes brought. And of course, Stefan Berg became Dr. Stefan Berg. And he's pushed that study on, further on, a great scholar in his own right.
Of course, Sligo being a coastal county as well, we have quite a lot of intertidal archaeology here, and you're actually here in Sligo today to deliver a lecture to the field club, which I'm part of this evening. Have you any favourite sites here in Sligo, either on land or that are at risk of being washed away potentially?
Well, Knockblane Promontory Fort is one of my favourite sites, because it's just, as a promontory fort, it's hard to beat it. So it's this huge, at the sort of northern end of the Rowley Peninsula, out on the end there, stunning location, huge, well-preserved ramparts. And that is one of my favourite sites. Now, it's not an immediate danger. All promontory forts are in danger to some degree. But of course, it had a medieval dimension to it. It's got this big outer rampart on it. But and of course, Aqua's Head is the other really fantastic site further down along. With the Holy Well down along the cliffs. And then as you come into the Bay of Killala, that lovely sweep in right into Inniscrone and all the way up into Ballina, like critical, that low-lying plain between the Ox Mountains and the coastal zone. Like, one of the features of it, one very interesting group just by Castleconnor. Now, Castleconnor is now in Mayo, but during the Down survey, it was in County Sligo.
We'll let you away with it this time.
Yeah, so it's right across the O'Dowd headquarters, later taken over by the Normans, and there's a deserted village on it, which you can see on the Down survey map, but it's still there on the ground. So that's one of these estuarine promontory forts. So very, very fantastic site, but just inland. So there was a Norman side taken over the O'Dowd, one of the O'Dowd strongholds, but just up, literally within a mile of it, in that there's a whole series of moated sites. So one of the very interesting sites, which I had, again, very little experiences, there's a whole complex of moated sites along the Oldmore River. You get them near Colony. You get them in little pockets, really well preserved. Now, I don't believe these are Irish sites. I think these are Norman sites, contrary to Kieran O'Connor. But you do have rectangular enclosures as well, like the one I was working on up in the Cashel. So the shape doesn't tell you a lot, but they're a fascinating group of sites all the way along. So that was one of the really interesting sites. And the other really thing which I loved about Sligo was the 1588 map of Sligo Bay, Donegal Bay, done in the aftermath of the Spanish Armada. And I still remember it. O'Scanlan, a holy man, dwelt on this island, of whom the country people hold a superstitious opinion, that if he do turn the 5 speckled stones upon them, they shall die within the year. So that's on a map from 1589, and that's one of our earliest references we have to the cursing stones of Inishmurray. But it was so important because this map is really, because it's an English view of this landscape, and of course it's accurate to a degree along the coast, but everything inland from the coast is complete Indian country still. And John Bingham, I think, was commissioned it. There's a lovely cartouche on it at Glencar, and it says, O'Donnell and his men camped by this lake and did see 2 water horses of a huge bigness. It goes up into the Barnsmore Gap, and it said the friars do rest themselves here, going probably north up into Garton. And there's other details of castles all along the coastline there. But and of course, then just off Grange, it has a little thing on the shore, 3 Spanish ships cast away. And that's why, of course, the map was made, was a follow-up of the Royal Navy coming through onto the coastline. So I think that map is illustrated in the Park Castle now, or it was anyway, but it's from the British Maritime Museum in Greenwich, of course.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic map. And those descriptions are just so lovely as well. Such a nice thing to have a capture of at the time.
Yeah.
And of course, Michael, you're a big man into maps yourself, and you've spent many years mapping the monuments of Ireland and also here in Sligo.
Yeah.
And I think for people at home, Sligo has just such a depth of archaeology, but all here in Sligo.
Yeah.
It must have took people a very long time to actually map all of that out.
Well, one I was just talking about today, when we were working on the survey here, I gave a lecture for the Field Club, I think it was. And a man came up to me afterwards and he showed me a photograph. And he says, don't walk away when I show you this photograph and tell you the size of this tomb. And I said, why would I walk away? He said, I've shared with several archaeologists before and they're not convinced. And it was Brendan Rooney from Glencar, former president of the Sligo Field Club. And he showed me a photograph of this long cairn up in the middle of the mountains above Glencar Lake, on the border with Sligo Leitrim. And I said, where is it? He said, well, it's a bit of a hike up. Well, I said, I'm well used to hiking. And we hiked up, my jaw dropped. It's one of the great discoveries of the Northwest, is that whole plateau from literally Truskmore almost into Manor Hamilton, above the Glenade. It's carpeted with a whole incredible range of sites. And I went up with Brendan, and and on the way in, he showed us a classic wedge tomb, which is at the southern end of this, in the middle of the plateau, but a little bit further in, and he came to a place, I remember he named it, he said, this is Mean the Mother Rua. So the grassy sward of the Fox, and there's field walls, and there's hut sites. And then I came to this incredible tomb. It's 60 metres long. It's a portal tomb, but starts off life as a round cairn. It's got a blind or false chamber at one end. But it's in the middle of the most difficult country on the planet. The burden looks like it's Plains of Mead by comparison to it. As it's sinkholes every 50 yards, and these are dropping hundreds of metres. So if the uplands there in that really rugged, difficult, and was always difficult terrain, because these sinkholes are thousands of years old, the lowlands must have been teeming with people. And population pressure is taking over that whole landscape. But on the way back there, we found another tomb, which is only 40 metres long. So big shout out to Brendan, and he's a lovely man, really, but knowledgeable. But what was also fascinating, the sort of episodic pulses of settlement from the valley here where we are, up on to the Benbulben Plateau, the Dartry Mountains, and there's Broca in Connemara Irish, we call them Broca, Booley sites. There's little trails for people for turf, getting turf off the top, and there's a whole 18th century history to those uplands that really hasn't been explored historically yet, but it was a hugely important place.
Yeah,
so
it just shows you what Sligo's got to offer, even in the hills where you wouldn't think people in the past might have gone. They were there and they were everywhere. by all accounts. But those stories that you bring up of people even coming to you and giving you those little hints or suggestions, maybe this is something, maybe that's something, I'm sure that's a common trend throughout your career of people highlighting things to you.
It has, but it's also a confidence thing. Some people, I've noted, and I worked all over Ireland, working for the OPW. We had 10 brilliant years working for them. And with Geraldine Stout, we're in charge of a whole survey unit, Sligo, Leitrim, Roscommon, parts of Kerry, Wexford, Waterford, Kildare, but was giving local talks in local communities. And you'd always have people coming up afterwards to talk. They mightn't have the confidence to say, ask a question, but being open and available. That's why having local archaeologists is so important in the community, because people know them, they trust them. I was out with Leo today from North Sligo, and he showed me 2 amazing sets of pairs of standing stones. And I was at a site I had last seen 40 years ago near Ballyshannon. But so that having a local field base, and the field club of course has been hugely important in this over many years. People have a contact. So I have found dozens of tombs in Connemara because people knew my mother, they played bingo with her, they worked with my father in England or in deepest Africa, and there was a link there, tangible. You weren't an official, you were somebody that they had a contact and a link with. So that's why lectures are so important and podcasts are important. So like that. So my time in Sligo, and of course I flew over Sligo as well. I've flown over the place with a lovely program I did with BBC on the colonisation of Ireland. And I was talking to this man about where would we go. I said, we'll go up onto Binbulben, Truskmore, that area. And he said, are you serious? Do you see the size I am? There's not a hope in hell. And I said, give me 20 minutes. So he came back, right, we're going to do it. And I said, well, what happened in 20 minutes? You were 18 stone, you're still 18 stone. Oh, he said, no, I rang the Enniskillen Field Club, our airport, there's a plane coming in doing a touch and go. We'll do it from the air. So we did an interview flying out over Coney Island, that fantastic star-shaped fort with a little harbour right underneath it. And then back up to Car, out over the top, looking at all, flying low over the plateau, out over Kinloch, Thievbawn, down over Mullaghmore, out to Inishmurray, in around Knocknarea. And of course the airport, flying into Sligo is such a treat. Like the airport with the little court home just on one side of the runway as you land, and all the big middens but then I said, well, now I know why you ended up as a producer with BBC, because he was able thinking on his feet. And the pilot, of course, was just doing a touch and go. If you're flying, you do touch and goes. And but like the beauty of Sligo from the air is other level of gorgeousness altogether, and all these incredible ring forts that you have, these large raised ring forts, barrow groups, just an exceptionally rich landscape. Like I suppose you don't realise it when you're in areas like there's hardly 10 ring forts in the whole of Connemara, an area half the size of Sligo. And they're just not there because the land isn't there to support them. So, the wealth of the land that's what's creating all this really. The farming history of the area is just immense.
And I think, Michael, sometimes people who live in Sligo, we take for granted what we have on our doorstep as well. Often through this podcast, people I'll be talking to maybe aren't from the area, but they have this additional awareness and love for the place because we just have so much going for us in terms of archaeology and heritage as well.
And the other quite amazing land is just above at Clare there, just down on the south side of the Ox Mountains. There's some fantastic cashels, field systems, 19th century landscapes, and then clusters of large tombs on granite. We don't have any tombs on granite in Connemara, none. They stay strictly on the metamorphosed limestones on the glacial tail, and once you leave that, Clifton Bay has one tomb on it. Over the next hill, there's a dozen on Streamstown Bay. They're a mile apart.
It's amazing. And
people are tied in. So ancient peoples were tied into the sort of farming potential of the place. And of course, the Mesolithic is a whole other ballgame altogether. And because I was involved in Knocknashee, the initial discovery of it, because I remember trying to get over the fence, getting my trousers caught, and I said, geez, this fence is stuck. This is a wall. This is a rampart. And then I said, holy God, the whole hill is enclosed. I know there's a bit of controversy over Knocknashee now, whether it is a hill fort or not. It is a hill fort. It's got 30 round houses, 2 tombs inside, and they found some Mesolithic material, if I remember the report right. So another incredible landscape. Muckelty Hill, extraordinary place with this huge cairn or Barrow Cairn, it's not clear, with a little hill fort on it. So that area of South Sligo, Turbercurry, down into Ballymote, then of course you've got one of the great sites of the world down in the whole Brickleave upland area there. And then I remember Temple House. Temple House is stunning. The Percival's family own it. Well, then you have the next lake below that, Clonacliha maybe, or some name like that. But there's a crannog on it with a causeway about 150 metres going out to it. And inside it there's another moated site. But when you're looking at the scale of the causeway took 10 times the effort to build the crannog on it. I remember flying over that with Marcus Casey. Marcus did his thesis on the coastal promontory forts of the west coast. So I flew from Allenhead to Dursey Island with him all along this coast. Several times the different sorties that we did up over here. So I got to see Sligo Leitrim from the air on the ground, and field walked a fair bit of it on and off, Amonte, now and again. So like I've had and then I remember going into Court Abbey one day on a really miserable damp day and looking up and looking at wall paintings. And I don't know, it was years since I was in Court Abbey now, but you have this incredible complex of earthworks around it and this amazing medieval complex there. The two biggest field trips I've ever led, one was to Knocknashee and the other one was to above Glencar with Brendan Rooney. And there was a couple of hundred people on each of those field trips.
And Michael, you're doing a bit of tour guiding yourself now at the moment. Can you tell people at home if they wanted to go on a tour with you in the west of Ireland or wherever else you're doing, how to get in contact with you?
Well, I get notes and I used to get letters saying Michael Gibbons beyond the 12 Bends, Ireland. I'm the only Michael Gibbons in Clifton. There's not that many Gibbonses in Clifton. The few that are there are very annoyed because they think everyone says, "Oh, you must be related to Michael Gibbons." It's so funny. I was on the radio last night, just an incident about the water shortages in Clifton.
I seen you on the RT actually the other day as well.
Yeah, and I the RT was all right, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine in Clare. He said, "You talk about a stick sticking out of a bog on television, wouldn't you?" Anyway, and another phone call came through because Eileen Mangins, our local Fine Gael councillor. And so I got this phone call. "Is that Michael Gibbons from Fianna Fáil, the Fianna Fáil councillor?" I said, "No." I said, "I'm an archaeologist." "Oh," down the phone.
Well, it's good to be well known anyway. But you do have a website that people can contact you and to learn more about what you're offering. So I do private trips. We don't have a schedule. So I was on the Skelligs like 3 or 4 times this year. I go regularly. I haven't been to Inishmore in years, so hopefully that'll be sorted out at some point because it's just stunning. I do think Inishmurray could be a potential world
heritage
site.
Well, it is.
As well.
Well, it is one, whether it's designated or not. It's such an and the later history of the island. It's just extraordinary place. So I do trips, lots of university groups and specialist groups. But not just that, just private groups. People ring me up, "I want to do this," and I'd say, "Well, why don't you try an archaeological field trip?" So we do lots of private archaeological field trips with small groups.
I want to ask you, what's your hope for the future of archaeology in Ireland in the next 50, 100 years? You've seen a lot of changes in the last 50. What would you like to see happen?
Well, I think we need to up our game. We have this huge resource. I've travelled quite a bit in Europe and the Middle East over the years. And Ireland is just like Sligo, if you think as a microcosm of Ireland. It's got thousands of well-preserved monuments, need investment, need resourcing, and they need archaeologists. Like, we have great scholars coming out of our universities. We need jobs for them. We need jobs in councils. We need little units. So we need to bring our game up to the level of the Scots. And that's right. Or Denmark. There's about 300 archaeologists in the Danish public service. And Denmark has an economy that's comparable with Ireland. So we need more archaeologists locally based in councils, because councils make decisions.
Michael, I think we're probably coming up out of time. So I'd just like to thank you again so much for coming on to the podcast to be our second guest on the show.
Thank you very much.
We might get you back again.
Okay.
And thank you, and safe travelling back to Connemara, and we'll see you again sometime soon, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So folks, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Discovering Sligo podcast. As ever, please give it a like and share on social media, and leave us a comment if there's anything that has tripped your imagination during the episode. Big thank you once again to Michael Gibbons, who was our guest speaker on this episode. He hails from Connemara, but has lots of experience of working in archaeology in Sligo over his career. So really interesting character, and I'm hoping that you really enjoyed that episode. As ever, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode, a series, or even just giving me money for a coffee, you can do it in lots of different ways. So drop me a message, or you'll find the coffee option on buymeacoffee.com/Sally Siggins. And thank you to those who have already agreed to sponsor. That sponsorship is very, very much appreciated. So on our next episode, episode 3, I will be interviewing Pádraig Meehan, who is a native of Roscommon but has a big passion for Sligo and lives locally now, and he is involved in the Sligo Neolithic Landscapes Group, who are working on the UNESCO World Heritage application for the Passage Tombs of County Sligo, and we talk all things from music to archaeology, so do join me on the next episode.